All right, good morning, everybody. It looks like we have a good crowd this morning for our August 3rd Thursday web forum. I can't believe it's August already, actually, now that I say that out loud. But it is. My name's Hillary. I work on Blueprint User Support and Communications for the South Atlantic LCC. We host this web forum every third Thursday of the month, hence the name, at 10 a.m. to give folks like you a chance to ask questions and provide input to help guide the conservation future of the South Atlantic. So we have the same agenda as usual for this month. We'll start by introducing our speaker, who will talk to us for 30 to 40 minutes or so about the topic for this month. We'll have plenty of time for Q&A and discussion. I'll do a quick preview of the next webinar and any LCC staff updates, and then we'll have another pause for questions and discussion about those updates. So before I hand things off to Rua today, a few logistics. As always, to minimize background noise, I'm going to mute everybody during the presentation. So if you have questions, either hold them until the time for Q&A at the end, or you can type them into the chat box, and I'll keep an eye on that throughout. So to speak at any time, all you need to do is press *6 to unmute your line. Any questions before I put us in silent mode? Okie doke.
The conference is now in silent mode.
Well, with that, presenting today, we have Mordecai, who is, of course, the science coordinator for the South Atlantic LCC, and he's going to be giving us an overview of the latest and greatest version of the Blueprint version 2.2. So take it away, Rua.
Awesome. Thanks, Hillary. Hello, everybody. I'm going to go grab the presenter power here. It's nice to see a lot of familiar faces on the WebEx. All right. So today, going to be talking about Hillary said, the latest update to the Blueprint, which is now version 2.2. So I'm just giving you a very quick Blueprint background. A lot of folks already know much about the Blueprint that I've seen on there, so I'll give you this sort of quick catch-up. Then we're going to dive into improvements into Blueprint 2.2. Both before and after the recent workshops, which is pretty fun. And then a little sneak peek at the Blueprint 2.2 implementation strategy as it is right now, and then we'll talk about next steps. So, should be fun. Just a general reminder, of course, mission of the cooperative, facilitating conservation actions guided by the shared adaptive blueprint. That was version 2.1. That looked fairly familiar to a lot of you. A reminder that that blueprint, that's our living spatial plan for prioritizing opportunities for shared conservation actions in the face of future change. So not just land protection, but the full suite of conservation tools in our toolkits, including economic incentives and education and that full suite of actions. So, over time, we're seeing more and more use of the blueprint. I'm not going to talk a lot about blueprint use because we're focusing on the latest version, but just wanted to show you the kind of updated version of this doc as we've kind of released a new version every year. The blue are number of uses that are complete, and then the red is in progress uses. So we're starting to see actually increasing demand now for people using the blueprint, and some cool examples from private companies, land trusts, other nonprofits, state agencies, federal agencies. Often we've got some examples of using it to make their proposals more competitive for funding, but also we're seeing more and more at different levels organizations looking to use the blueprint as bigger organizational prioritizations for how they focus effort in the region. So that's pretty exciting. In fact, we're basically at a new blueprint use every week, getting some kind of contact to staff on help or learning about them. So that's pretty nice to see. All right, so very quickly, how's the blueprint developed? So we have a series of ecosystems, things like our marine, our estuarine, our forest wetlands. So within each of those ecosystems, we have a series of indicators. And then within each of those ecosystems, we do a prioritization using a tool called zonation to make sure we have high quality representation from all of those different indicators that we put together. So now we're keeping it balanced, the amount of prioritization across each of these ecosystems. Then we put them all together into a combined integrity layer across all the different ecosystem types. And then we use a tool called Linkage Mapper to bring in the connectivity. So now we're trying to find the least cost path between our different large hubs of priority. So the goal here is to take the shortest distance through as much blueprint priority as possible between our hubs. And then we get to the blueprint priorities. So that's a very quick crash reminder of how the blueprint comes together. And then for those priorities, we break them into a number of different priority classes. They each cover a set amount of the South Atlantic area. You see on the right kind of a visual depiction of those different priority classes, from highest to high, medium, and corridors to not a shared priority. So these are all priorities for shared conservation actions. And all those percentages come from the literature and various planning documents to balance conservation and human use. So really, we're a heavily impacted area here in the South Atlantic, a lot of human demands. And so pulling from a bunch of global and local synthesis and also state and local county plans where they've wrestled with that idea of how much might be doable in order to facilitate human use, but also maintain ecosystems. That's where they come from. That's the color scheme we'll be looking at for a little bit here. Okay, so here's, I'm going to show you some of the changes real quick, and then we'll go into the details of those different changes and improvements. This is Blueprint 2.1. You see the scale over there. That sort of darkest color is highest priority. The gray is corridors. So this is version 2.1. And here is the change going to 2.2, the workshop draft that you looked at. So the biggest changes we did, we'll talk a little bit about some of the improvements on the terrestrial side, some changes in corridors and priorities. But the biggest, most obvious change you'll see is in the marine environment, where we've made some bigger improvements. So that was into the workshop draft. And then after the workshop draft, after all the different reviews, we've made a number of other improvements into the final version, which is here. So excuse the shifting. But basically, we'll talk about some of the changes in priorities and corridor routes that happened between the workshop and the final version as well. So improvements before the workshop. So a few things before even the workshop into this next version. We updated a few indicators, the resilient biodiversity hotspots. We have newer data from TNC on that, so incorporated that, updated the unaltered beach layer. So they've updated a few indicators based on the newest data, and also a new indicator, marine birds, which really helped on improving some of the marine prioritization. This also resolved the known issue we had of under-prioritizing the eastern part of the right whale calving ground. So that was one of the known issues of the last version. Pretty well covered now that we folded in the marine birds, which is cool. So those are some of the big improvements before the workshops. So, bigger in the marine, but some smaller updates going into this last version. Then we went into the workshops. So the goal there was to kind of review the blueprint update, improve the blueprint implementation strategy, and then vote on cooperative focus for the next year. I'm just going to talk about the top two here today. But just a reminder, we had these workshops, 6 different workshops spread throughout the South Atlantic geography. They're a lot of fun. Great seeing everyone in person and visiting some fun places. Had a mess of different folks from different organizations, good balance across state, federal, nonprofit organizations. But for those of you that were at workshops, everyone had its own different flavor. So first thing, reviewing the blueprint update. So for those who are there, you remember pouring over some maps and circling some various areas and trying to identify things that might be missing priorities or over prioritized. And then after all of those, we digitized the different comments from the workshops. That has been really awesome and super helpful in making improvements after the workshop, and I think will be helpful in the future versions as well. So I'll talk about how we've been using those, which is very cool. So we've been making some improvements after the workshops. So diving into all those different comments and reviews. We fixed some corridor routes. Spent a little time looking at some different options onto that. And so I'll show you an example here. This is so the southeast corner is Charleston, and so up in the top that's Lake Moultrie, Lake Marion. And so there is a corridor, that one gray line going up, And when folks had looked at that particular corridor, they had said, well, hold on a second. Actually, the way we've been planning and thinking about it, this route makes a lot more sense from an overall corridor and connectivity perspective. And so we tried a few different routes. We looked at a number of other corridors where folks said, hey, this doesn't make as much sense. We're not sure this corridor is right. Changed some methods, and so now we have a route going through that section of so that's one example in South Carolina. We got some examples in North Carolina, Georgia, and Florida too, where we've improved some of the routes and corridors that folks took a look at and said, "Oh, I'm not sure this is the best way to go." So some of the corridors are improved, which is nice. And this is where having a lot of the eyeballs on it and really getting specific has been very helpful. Another thing, you might have already noticed this, we stopped prioritizing the open water in lakes and reservoirs. So we don't have specific indicators for that. And one of the things we had done is kind of looked at the priority around the shores of those lakes and reservoirs and then filled in from there. During the workshop and some other reviews, there's a lot of folks weren't so excited about the results of that analysis and how it came together and what the priorities were showing. And so you may have noticed here, Lake Moultrie just above that circle that's pink here is now blue. So we have a class that's this sort of inland water bodies that were lakes and reservoirs that we're not prioritizing now. So that's one other thing we've done from improvements after the workshops. And we'll be revisiting and looking at those, some other ways to do it, and maybe indicators that work a little better into the future for those areas. I've also improved the use of the low urban historic landscapes indicator, particularly within cities. So here's an example, one of the comments that came out in the workshops in Tallahassee, right in the middle, you've got this high priority block. And so, the intent in that indicator is it does give some value to historic places that are higher urban, but they shouldn't be coming out super high because they're lower in the indicator. So in this case, this block in the center, kind of right around the TAL in Tallahassee, was coming out a little bit too high. And so we've tweaked some of the methods and improved the historic landscape preservation or historic landscapes indicator. And that's also helped with some places where they overly influenced the corridor routes. And that was one of the issues with in the previous blueprint, and between our corridor methods and this, we've resolved a lot of those issues too. So that's another thing. And also, one of the issues that came up in the workshops, particularly in the Piedmont, was how much of the priority was in more of the upland, farther out of the active river areas in the Piedmont. I got a lot of high diversity important components that are going on the aquatic side, but folks felt like there was just a little too much in those more riparian areas and not enough far enough in the uplands. And so one of the nice bonuses of stopping prioritizing the open water in lakes and reservoirs is we noticed that had also been kind of under prioritizing some of the Piedmont uplands. And so once we fixed the open water, it actually made some improvements in the Piedmont uplands. So here's an example. We're right at the sort of Georgia-South Carolina border. This is the top left area with that high priority areas are around the Chattahoochee National Forest. That's kind of an orientation. This is the workshop draft from 2.2, and this is the final version. So keep your eye on the sort of pinks and purples here, and you'll see we've got more that's sitting higher in the uplands in this version since the workshop draft that went out there. So that was a nice thing to be able to fix as well. So you'll notice some of that in the final version. And then another big thing we've done is we've improved the documentation of known issues. So that's having all these eyeballs at it for things that we couldn't fix. So we're particularly helpful in improving our known issues documentation. And although we haven't incorporated it in yet, I will show you really quickly the sort of some of the known issues. So we've actually included a number of areas. Some of these are ones that are still known issues. Some of these are a little bit more specific to specific places and new ones. I'll give you one example here for those of you that had noticed So right here, for those of you that have noticed some issues of maybe under prioritizing a few specific areas on river basins, we've called them out specifically in the known issues. So sections of some rivers seem to be under prioritized, including Nottoway, Lumber, which is the North Fork of the Edisto was one that came out a lot. Not going to read them all, but just kind of give you an example of some of the pieces we're trying to call out. And in general, what we are trying to do with each of these known issues is identify the issue, some places it happens, and then talking about what we're trying to do to fix it. This one was ongoing. Another example of we're under prioritizing some forested wetlands and call that a specific area along the Black River in South Carolina. Here's, caused by issues depicting current and future historic wetlands, and the finer resolution approach for the next blueprint under excavation should help improve this issue. So we're striving for here's the issue, here's where it's happening, here's what we're doing to try to fix it. So that'll be nice. There's a lot of these issues were actually also issues in 2.1. We just didn't have them as well documented. So that'll be nice. Better documentation of the known issues. Then also going to be folding this new version of Blueprint into the next version of the Southeast Conservation Adaptation Strategy. So that I think is going to get released in, I think it's October. And so there are updated input layers from the South Atlantic, the North Atlantic, and the Appalachians that are going into that. So I've been working on looking at the layers and helping theme up various pieces. So this new version of the blueprint will also go into the new version of the Southeast Conservation Adaptation Strategy blueprint. Data access. Once we officially release this next version of the blueprint, you'll have it up on the Conservation Planning Atlas if you want to download the layers and add additional layers to it. And we'll also be updating the Blueprint Simple Viewer to include this next version of the blueprint. And we also have a lot of other really cool features of the Simple Viewer we've been working on, including some what we've been calling kind of our Pixel Hunter feature, where you'd actually be able to click on specific places and see for each of the pixels what indicators and things are underneath. So that'll be pretty cool. So we'll be updating that fairly soon. All right, so that is the data side of things and accessing information from Blueprint 2. The other thing we were trying to do at the workshop was improve the blueprint implementation strategy. And so you remember, it's not just about making a really awesome, well-grounded kind of map. It's about coming together to make this big change. How do we take those scores in the state of the South Atlantic and kind of raise our scores and improve the ecosystems together? So you may have remembered, especially if you were at the workshop, and over the last few years, we've talked about these components of the blueprint implementation strategy, supporting blueprint uses, improving the blueprint, promoting the blueprint, and also how we go from the blueprint and the work going on in the cooperative and the time and effort that y'all are spending on this, and how does that lead us then to improving the integrity of the ecosystems? So, how does that lead us to making proposals more competitive, especially for national funding pots? And how does this help individuals and organizations use the blueprint to guide their work, which we want to get to these outcomes of new resources for conservation in the South Atlantic and more efficient use of what we have. So just a quick reminder about that path we talked about in the blueprint workshops. And where we last left off was we were going to create this updated blueprint implementation strategy for this version. So we're going to take input from the workshops, input from earlier workshops, and then synthesize information from other action plans that many of you have already been part of, and pull them all together into a version of the blueprint implementation strategy. So I'm going to give you a sneak peek. You'll actually see you should be getting a draft to review in next month's newsletter, a chance to kind of review and comment on this. But I want to give you a quick sneak peek of what the implementation strategy looks like here. I'll make it a bit bigger here. So what we have here other than our executive summary. A little bit of information about kind of talking about this connection and the ideas of how to use a blueprint to improve ecosystem integrity, and just the general approach, the conceptual diagram I showed before. And we talked about how we go from inputs into actually improving the integrity of the South Atlantic. Talk about the response to urban growth and sea level rise and the strategy for that. And then a bulk of the report is actually recommended actions by subregion. So this is all very draft. Again, we got a few other folks that are going to be looking at this before it goes out in your hands, but I'm just going to give you a quick preview of general where it's going. So we have this sort of idea of the blueprint itself doesn't really talk about specific actions in specific places, and it's very fine scale, 200 meter pixel kind of thing. So we don't have actions for all those pixels. And so in this version, basically, we're going down to the subregions of the South Atlantic and then talking about kind of recommended conservation actions in those regions. So the idea is these actions would be happening within the blueprint itself, or be contributing to those blueprint areas. And so then what we have, so this is kind of a reminder of those regions. These are the 7 subregions of the South Atlantic. We do a lot of things. You probably remember if you were in one of the workshops, you were probably in one of these sub-regional breakout groups. And so we kind of bring stuff. This is a combination of terrestrial and aquatic ecoregions for those subregions. And so for the actions, we break them down by those different subregions in the draft right now. And basically, we've pulled all the blueprint feedback, workshop feedback, plus information from 19 other implementation strategies, including wildlife action plans, coastal habitat plans, local plans, Gullah Geechee, corridor management plan, big mix of different components in here. And we've used them specifically detailed for each of the subregions. So only the actions that apply and were meant within each of these different subregions apply. So everyone's a little different. And I'll show you give you a quick sense here of what the sections look like. Gulf Coastal Plain is a starting point. We've got sections on what success looks like. So in the workshops, we had a lot of those, what if we succeed or what if we fail? And so we pulled out kind of 10 very representative ones for each of the subregions that talk about what success looks like in the region and then what failure looks like in the region. So, failure looks like in the Gulf Coastal Plain, seawalls from end to end along the coastal front. This kind of nightmarish scenarios. So those are very nice. You get some broad themes that cut across these, but also some things that are fairly local to the different regions. And then we have the different actions organized by the open standards for the practice of conservation categories, and we have all of those and the different sources for where the action came from. So this is fairly nice in understanding the actions themselves, but also if you're writing proposals in some of these subregions and you're looking for connecting in with not just the blueprint, but some of these other plans, this is a nice resource for you to kind of find multiple plans and action plans that have identified specific types of actions that you may be doing. So that's basically what it looks like right now. There's a lot of different kind of actions and components from each of those plans and from the workshop itself. And then we do the same thing for each of the other sub-region here. So that's Gulf. Now we're in Central Coastal Plain. So you have some things that are consistent, resilient connected ecosystems that protect coastal plain communities' quality of life and economies. Major common theme, residents having an understanding of the ecosystems they live in. But also some kind of what success looks like that are specific, like I mentioned before. So we're in the Central Coastal Plain, so places you can see Bachman sparrow and pine barrens tree frogs, swallowtail kites, robust red horse, gopher frogs. So it's a fairly nice starting point here. And so that's a very quick preview of what this implementation strategy looks like right now. You'll have a chance to dig in at whatever level you want at the next newsletter and provide some feedback and thoughts on structure and actions. It's like 67 pages, so that's why I say at whatever level you want. About probably 15 to 20 of those pages are purely just information from the blueprint and workshops and other things, and the rest are other added information from these other plans. The idea being, we don't want to redo the good work of others. And if we've had some of these discussions about these regions in other formats recently, let's bring that forward. So that is your sneak peek into the implementation strategy. Let's go next here. All right, now on to next steps. So the official release of the Blueprint update is planned for the fall. So we do have now the final kind of spatial data layers, but there's a lot of work to package things up, make sure we got all the metadata all cleaned up nicely, get things in the various viewers, so that official release will be the nice full packages, but also getting all the information up in the viewers. But I mentioned before, actually a couple times, the draft of the updated Blueprint implementation strategy should be out for broader review in the next month's newsletter, so take a look at that. Give you a chance to chew on that. We'll also have a web forum coming up in a few months where we'll have a chance to dig deeper and maybe even prioritize some of those actions. And then work on the next Blueprint update is going to start after we release the previous one. And there's a lot of really cool stuff we have in the works for the next one. It's very difficult as we get closer to the release cycle because you get more and more really great stuff you want to do and not enough time to do it in this particular version. But a teaser of a couple things. We've got some approaches to get to finer resolution, finer than 200 meters, that we think we can pull off. We want to explore some improved approaches for connectivity, using parcel size as we get our sort of parcel geometry data for the region. A ton of potential for improved indicators. We've got good leads on things for greenways, recreation, at-risk species, patch size, oysters. Ton of really cool stuff that we can work on for the next version. So lots of exciting stuff even in store for the next release. And that is what I have. So with that, I guess I will open it up for questions.
Yeah, plenty of time for Q&A. Just remember *6 to unmute. If you'd rather type into the chat box, that's fine too. There's got to be some questions. Don't be shy.
Hey, I've got one. I don't know if you can hear me. This is Jeremy Poyer. I've got a question related. I think it was the Fish and Wildlife Service project or the other map that they're developing. I'm confused on how all these kind of connect.
Let's see.
So just if you go back in your deck a little bit, maybe I missed something there. I can tell you when to stop. It's the other. I forgot the acronym. The other map that's
Southeast Conservation Adaptation Strategy.
Yeah, yeah, right there. Can you explain that a little better and kind of how these all connect?
Yeah, sure. So, and actually, this one's a pretty nice, clean connection here. So, basically, what happened was, so this strategy was requested by the different state directors from all the Fish and Wildlife agencies from the Southeast Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, and then later the 12 federal agencies in the Southeast Natural Resource Leadership Group said, hey, we want an adaptation strategy for the South, and we want it in, I think, 5 years or something like that was what they were looking for. And they said, well, one of the things we need is this sort of, good map, this blueprint of priority places. And so they said, well, hey, the best place to go looks like it would be, let's do it through the network of landscape conservation cooperatives. And so basically this sort of blueprint here is literally just a combination of all the different blueprints throughout from each of the cooperatives. So I was talking about the South Atlantic Conservation Blueprint. And so if you go into the South Atlantic region here, this is that version 1 that I showed before. And so we have these things, basically, seamed up and connected together in a way that they're all speaking the same language. So we keep we have similar thresholds and priorities, and some rules for what to do in overlap zones. And so it's sort of in this case, this blueprint is used when you're thinking, okay, well, I'm looking for the prioritization, but I want to cover a broader area of the South, the whole longleaf range, or the whole bunch of multi-state areas that cut across LCCs. This is designed to sort of be that blueprint for you if you want to cut across those larger areas. So it's been a vehicle for integration and thinking about the best way to seam them up. But from a data perspective, the Peninsula Florida blueprint, South Atlantic, Gulf Coastal Plains and Ozarks, Appalachian, they're basically all added up and seamed together in this version.
Okay, well that helps. So I guess the second question is when you guys continue to update the blueprint and refine it and all that, is there a process that this gets updated as well?
Yep, every year. So there's a yearly update cycle that happens every fall. And so right about around this time is the cutoff for each of the cooperatives to add their latest update contribution. And so every year, just like so far we've been updating this South Atlantic blueprint every year this gets updated too. And if you've got new layers from each cooperative, that's when they come in. We're hoping to fill in maybe in this version Oklahoma and a few other things too. So yeah, this is a yearly update cycle, and it's timed with the SIAFWA directors meeting, which comes in the fall. So then we kind of got this layer where all the points of contact for those organizations get to look at it, put any feedback in, and then it gets updated. So
okay. And this is available online where?
Yeah, so this is available on. I'll pull this up right here. In the way. Right now, actually, probably the best place to go is CCAS Southeast, which is the Southeast Conservation Adaptation Strategy website. And so that gives you a link here in the blueprint. You can download the actual the data and the maps. And it's a similar, download the data now. It's the same kind of platform and interface. Actually, it is working right now. So you can go in here and just download those directly.
All right. I appreciate your help.
Yeah, no problem.
You can actually also overlay, if you're interested in exploring the South Atlantic blueprint and the CCAS blueprint, those data layers are all available on our Conservation Planning Atlas for the South Atlantic too.
Okay.
Yep. Yeah, so there's kind of a network system. So here we are. This is the Southeast region window. So if you're Southeast wide, then you can get to any of the individual ones if you want to drill into the different. So this is the South Atlantic and the blueprints here. So we try to make it at least somewhat consistent and easy to move between them, whether you're doing the whole region like you can from here in the South Atlantic or back into subregions.
Very helpful. Thank you.
There's another question in the chat box from Mary Morrison. Will there be any public meetings for the rollout? I would say probably our blueprint workshops where we're still, revising the draft is probably the closest thing that we have to public meetings. But do you have anything to add to that, Rua?
Yeah, I think that is the closest. I mean, we haven't actually done sort of a big public rollout meeting. I mean, typically what happens is the big meetings have been in the workshops where people look at the draft and kind of get their hands on it. And then what we've done so far, a lot of the rollout happens through various meetings where organizations that are interested will, some of us as staff or other folks that are part of the cooperative that may not be staff are kind of giving talks about blueprint to other groups. Like Hillary was just down meeting with a bunch of folks with Tall Timbers staff and others just a couple days ago, yesterday, just talking about the blueprint. And so, yeah, generally the rollouts have sort of happened more one-on-one as different organizations, either state or local, want to use the blueprint, and they're more kind of smaller, hey, here it is, more interactive so far. That's how we've been doing things.
We've even been talking about, our goal someday for the blueprint and for this annual update cycle is that it's pretty seamless, like you don't get a big rollout from Microsoft when they've updated Word to version whatever necessarily, that you just sort of use the latest version and things update pretty seamlessly. So we want to make sure that we're explaining clearly what has changed from one version of the blueprint to another, but would like it to be pretty seamless for everybody.
Ideally, in the future, we get that nice experience where you're just using it and you don't have to worry about.
Yeah, you're like, I don't know what version I'm on. I know it's the latest one.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
Yeah.
Plenty of time.
Question, Mary.
Ru, this is Chris.
Hey, Chris.
I've got a question. In this version and other ones, this iterative process where people get together and say, "Well, I think this is underrepresented or overrepresented," and then you make adjustments, and then people are more happy with it, I suppose. But at what point are we forcing it to be what we want it to be versus having the data speak for itself?
The only really changed, so just because someone says, I think this is underrepresented or I'm not sure why this is a priority, doesn't mean we actually try to change any methods. Generally, the only time we go and try to change methods is if people identify something that's underrepresented, then we chase it down. For example, in the forested wetlands is a good example. Known issues where we had a number of folks that were identifying areas they thought weren't prioritized highly, enough, and they tended to be forested wetlands. And so it's more of a signal to dig deeper into the blueprint and see, is this a data problem, or is this maybe a just information opinion kind of situation? So generally what we do is we dig in, and so we don't actually sort of go in and like, let's move this over here. We try to figure out if there's a root problem. So in the forested wetlands, this does seem to be an issue, and one of the global challenges we've had is with depicting kind of current and historic forested wetlands. And so it seems like that's actually a problem in how we're depicting historic and current forested wetlands is the problem why a few of those places were not coming out as high as they likely should. And so that's generally the approach we've taken is try to figure out, like you said, is it just kind of someone's opinion, or is there really some underlying challenge or data limitation in the blueprint that we need to chase down? And then we try to fix the underlying data problem and not just the opinion problem. Does that make sense?
Good. Thanks.
Anybody else? Something did just occur to me in response to your question, Mary, about rolling out the blueprint. There is sort of a rollout for the CCAS blueprint that happens at the big CAFWA annual meeting every year. That would be just something I would note, that if you're interested in the rollout of the update to the Southeast Conservation Adaptation Strategy blueprint for the whole Southeast, there's usually a summit or a big to-do at CAFWA related to that. Mm-hmm. All right, I'll be quiet here for like 10 more seconds.
Hey, this is Jeremy Poirier again. Here's one for the whole group. I have not been involved in some of the workshops. I work for a large forest products company. I know a lot of my counterparts and some other folks in the industry have attended the workshops, but I'm kind of curious on maybe the kind of groups. This is maybe just a group question and kind of what you guys are seeing going forward. I mean, I'm buying fiber from private landowners across this entire landscape, and on tracks that are falling into, let's just say a high priority area. What is without all the kind of backgrounds of the whys behind a certain area? How do we how does the team envision going forward on helping organizations like us that are ultimately working with the landowners when they are doing for example, a timber harvest? What does the conversation need to look like on a high priority track on far as what they can and cannot do? That's kind of a big open question, but I'm trying to kind of make the link between a lot of good work that's gone into the development of the map, and then for the folks like us who are working with all these non-industrial private landowners to help them make the right decisions to not only do what they have to do, but to kind of help the whole region. So I'll just kind of leave it at that.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I throw that out to other folks on the line too. That part of what this gets into is actually into that blueprint implementation strategy that we're starting to try to flesh out to get into the. I didn't actually show another. There's another thing that I also show as we kind of as you mentioned, is we've got these broad categories that you can break the blueprint up into and start getting a sense of kind of why it's coming out and what actions may make the most sense in different places. That kind of gets at, hey, these are really coming out for their aquatic resources, and so some of these management practices for aquatics are going to be the most important versus some other kind of important for longleaf and pieces. But we're working on trying to get a little bit down to that, getting a little closer to some of that area of kind of what might those shared actions be. But for the most part, it's been the sort of common language that if we're moving down into a smaller region, we then look to that broader network of folks that are part of the cooperative that have some of those relationships and have a little bit more of the specific information about what particular piece or kind of a role of private landowner might be in that, which particular best management practices or other components that would fit. In general, real strong desire for a lot of sort of economic incentives, working lands kind of programs, because we're basically 91% private land across the South Atlantic. So, and as you know, I mean, working with the conservation community here, a lot of support for some of those working lands pieces. But we're trying to work down to some of those questions at the bigger blueprint level. But a lot of those more specific questions so far handed over to the coalitions of folks in some of these subregions and places that might know that particular land a little bit better. So any other folks, or am I getting that? Does that sound about reasonable to where we're at right now?
And this is Mallory. Can everyone hear me?
Yep.
Yeah. So Jeremy, this is Mallory Martin. I'm the coordinator for your cooperative, the South Atlantic, and I think that's a really good question. And Rua hit on some very fine points there that require a little bit of nuance to really get down in the weeds on. And I think the way that I view this is once you're looking at the priority for a particular area, and being able to dig into the blueprint and see what's driving that priority. And as Rua mentioned, in some cases it may be something on the aquatic side. On other cases, it may be connectivity or the association with a particular habitat type or particular ecosystem like longleaf or something else. So I think there are lots of opportunities to see how those drivers of blueprint priority are considered in terms of best management practices or a particular forest management practice that is being considered or promoted for a particular landowner. So there's lots of opportunities to dig in and see what are driving those elements and then responding to those more specifically at a localized level.
The other thing I would add real quick is that, this is Rue again, is that we do a lot of one thing's a little different about this blueprint effort and even extends to CCAS if you want some help with that, is that we actually have folks like Hillary and all of the staff that actually help folks use the blueprint in different ways that kind of make the most sense for each organization, because you have this broad shared piece, but then the big question is, okay, well, where's my part, depending on what questions, and if I'm working for a private forest products company, where am I, what's the best fit for some of those questions. And so we'd be glad to kind of work with you if you want us to help with some tailoring or kind of get some of the best information and connections to use the blueprint or even CCAS in the way you're looking to use it. So that's still it's only a few years old, so we're working on it's really driven mostly by the users at this point as far as how we break things down and how we make it easy to answer some of those questions. So.
Yeah, this is Hillary. Definitely would be happy to talk to you more about that offline, about how to make the blueprint and the indicator information useful in your decision making and help get to answers to some of those great questions that you raised.
Yeah, I appreciate all the comments, and that's kind of what I was, what I was looking at. You can understand the challenge that we have with the I think positive conversations we can have with landowners and wood suppliers and all that, but it's to really, the ultimate, what's my experience has been, what you can't do is just say, hey, you have a really kind of high risk track or a track that's kind of coming up in a system that says high conservation area. Well, that's nice, and most of them I think have a receptive ear. But then the question is always next. Okay, so now what? So you're right. I mean, and everyone said it. I appreciate that, and that ultimately I think is going to drive it. Could possibly drive some change if there's some good working recommendations on things that, like you said, the 90% of those landowners out there that can do on and everyone, as all of you know, every case and unfortunately every track and every landowner is usually different, and that's the challenge. But anyway, I can help. Just reach out to me and let me know.
Awesome. Thanks. Yeah, that sounds great. The other thing I was going to mention, which is part of the strategy, is that once things are kind of priority in the blueprint, we try to actually, through a couple of different levers, kind of help accelerate conservation on those places. So we've been doing some work on things like impact of sort of longleaf management on water yield and some stuff that might help develop some water markets and help incorporate forest management into some water planning and, helping when they're actually applying for funds, helping fill in some of those pieces of, okay, well, how does my parcel impact these different resources? So helping people tell their story in a way that might help kind of elevate the resources they can get as landowners or as organizations. So that is one of the channels. So yeah, glad to follow up on that. That's great.
And Jeremy, we'd love to talk with you offline and dig into this a little bit more. So we'll try to set that up.
I appreciate it.
Would anyone else like to jump in here?
Hey, this is Cindy. I was wondering how much some of the data sets that we as states have put together have been incorporated. For instance, with our North Carolina Wildlife Action Plan, we have HUC 12 priorities and 1 kilometer riparian buffer priorities that tie into our Wildlife Action Plan. I'm just curious as to whether or not those were incorporated, and if so, to what extent?
So, hey, Cindy. It's a mix. It depends on, there are a number of state data sets and pieces and even some things, some action plans that are incorporated and some things that aren't. One of our big challenges has been, sort of getting them apples to apples across state boundaries. Especially when you may have something for a couple states, but you're missing one state, and in that case, then that state that's missing it gets kind of undervalued, and so it's kind of an interesting mix. We try to bring in a lot of stuff, the stuff we can that we can have make sense across boundaries we fold in, but other things where we don't have equivalence or we can't get them to match up, we don't end up using in this blueprint, but we do sort of look at them as validation layers to see, okay, well, this came out in a priority. Is it also a priority in the blueprint? Is there some mismatch, and then why? So if there's some stuff that's, a priority in one section and some other plans, but isn't a priority in the blueprint, that's kind of like that review before. It's like, okay, so what's going on here? Why are we missing that piece? Or vice versa, if it's in the blueprint and not in there. So there are some states, some species data, some habitat data, maritime forests and survey stuff that we use directly. The actions from the Wildlife Action Plan are all used in that new blueprint implementation strategy. So all the different sort of action and all the work on that are folded back into that strategy that you'll see soon. But yeah, it is a mix, and it very much depends on what we can get to seam across state lines in an apples to apples kind of framework.
So riparian buffers, for example, we do have a riparian buffer indicator as part of our freshwater aquatic cross-ecosystem category. But whether it's the exact riparian buffer data set that you're using in the SWAP, I would probably have to dig into the metadata to see whether those data come from the same place.
Yeah, the priority buffers, I think, I remember with this, there's not an equivalent for the other states, and I think the South Atlantic version uses the active river area, and so I think that particular was one that's more of a validation data set than one that had an equivalence across the other states, if I'm remembering correctly. I'll have to double check on that for you, though.
Rua, could you talk a little bit more about how validation data sets are used?
You're on mute. Sorry, Amy.
Oh, yeah, sorry. Could you ask that, Hillary?
Amy's suggesting that we talk a little bit more about how validation data sets are used.
Yeah, so I could mention some of that. One of the big things we try to do, we've got a few different ways we use. So if there are data at a state level or finer that we can't use in the blueprint, we use them in a few different ways. One way for the indicators. So in some cases, like some of the sort of the heritage prioritizations in North Carolina, for example, we've used that in validating actually a few different things on our aquatics and even the blueprint itself. But we'll use it for individual indicators, like our imperiled aquatic species, to see if we're missing spots or what lines up, and then if we've got something that's more holistic, we use it for the whole blueprint. So it's something that, okay, well, if we can't use it across, are we pretty much capturing those key components? And so that's how we've used a lot of the validation data sets. And sometimes it's point level monitoring data that we compare to our GIS models and our indicators to make sure that they're working right. If they're not working right, then we fix them. And then anything that we can't capture, we try to, or issues we find that we can't fix, we then try to document in the known issues.
Awesome. Might have time for one more question. Bill Bardish, it looks like you have your Ask to Speak button on. Is that intentional? Sometimes I click it on accident. *6 to unmute if you want to speak up. Okay, well, I guess I will move along here. Just want to give a quick preview of next month's web forum. So thank you so much, Rua. I'm going to take the presenter power back here.
Go for it.
And just show a couple slides here before we call it a day. All right. And we're sharing. Okie doke, so next month, Rua's going to be getting into some more detail about that draft blueprint implementation strategy that he previewed today. As he said, that's kind of outlining a pathway for improving the integrity of the ecosystems of the South Atlantic by really translating the blueprint into action. So we're going to leave a lot of time on that webinar next month to get input on prioritizing and ranking the various actions, giving feedback on the strategy. And as Rua said, that will go out in the newsletter in early September, so should have some time to read it, to ruminate on it, and definitely join us on September 21st right here at 10 a.m. if you want to participate in that feedback session on the implementation strategy. Usually I give staff updates, but basically we all heard those at the end of Rua's talk in the next steps for the blueprint, since that's really what we're focused on right now. So I'll just wrap up by saying if you're interested in getting more involved in your cooperative, please join our web community. That'll get you signed up to get our monthly newsletter and a reminder email about this web forum. In particular, I might point you to a blog that Mallory recently wrote, giving an update on a little bit of the uncertain budget that might be useful to you if you're interested in learning more about that. That was as an update to the steering committee that we also sent out in the newsletter recently. You're also welcome, obviously, to talk to staff, talk to other members of your cooperative. Please explore the blueprint online. Ask your staff if you have questions. So I'll pause here for any additional questions that anybody might have before we sign off. Okay, well, it's just about 11, so that's it from us. Thanks again, Rua, for presenting. Hope you all will join us in September. Take care.
Thanks. Bye, everybody.